Welcome to the Center Square Radio Hour for the first weekend of 2025. I'm your host, Chris Krug. The Center Square, the Radio Hour, projects of the Franklin News Foundation, a 501c3 independent nonprofit, nonpartisan news service. Established in 2019, the Center Square Newswire publishes original taxpayer-centric street news that focuses on the size, scope, and effectiveness of local, state, and federal government. On the Center Square Radio Hour, our journalists explore their top stories, adding insight to the headlines. We'll also present thoughts on the economy from Dr. Orphe Divounguy, PhD economist, and bring you the latest in K-12 education news for our Franklin News Foundation's Chalkboard News team. Today, we'll hear about the terrorist attack in New Orleans and the closely timed explosion of a Tesla Cybertruck in front of the Trump International Hotel in Las Vegas on New Year's. We'll get the collapse of a historic wharf in California, and we'll reflect on the death of former President Jimmy Carter. We'll be right back with all that and more in the Center Square Radio Hour.
Are you tired of news that puts politics over people? At the nonprofit Franklin News Foundation, we believe in putting people over politics by delivering nonpartisan news and audio content that serves you, the American taxpayer. With Franklin News Foundation, you can read fact-based, state-focused news for free at thecentersquare.com. You can listen to civil, balanced conversations between policy experts through our podcast network at americastalking.com. Or you can get in-depth news on K-12 education spending, curriculum, and school safety at chalkboardnews.com. It's all free through Franklin, where we put you, the American taxpayer, first in every story, episode, and conversation. And it's only possible through our supporters. Together, we can produce content that puts people over politics and brings Americans the news they deserve. Become a supporter today at franklinnews.org/donate. Once again, that's franklinnews.org/donate.
Teacher Lauren Johnson returned all the graded essays but one. He believed that one student was capable of more.
I don't believe taking the middle of the road is your philosophy. This time, write something you really believe.
The student wrote a new one about excellence. Instead of just grading an essay, Mr. Johnson changed a life. I am that student. I became a writer, and I wrote this to thank him.
Thank a teacher and pass it on from passiton.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on the New Year's terrorist attack in New Orleans and the explosion of the Tesla Cybertruck in front of Trump International Hotel in Las Vegas, it's Dan McCaleb. New Year's revelers on the famed Bourbon Street in New Orleans early Wednesday were greeted by an Islamic State sympathizer who barreled his vehicle into large crowds, killing 14 and injuring dozens of others. The attacker himself was shot and killed after firing on New Orleans police officers. Federal, state, and local authorities continue their investigation into the massacre, but the FBI says there's no doubt this was an unprovoked act of terrorism. Joining me to discuss this is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, law enforcement initially said that the attacker, Shamas Din-Jabbar, likely had help, but the FBI came out Thursday and said they now believe he acted alone. What more can you tell us?
Well, I can tell you that there's a very deadly attack, about 15 killed, many more injured or wounded as the driver plowed into a busy street in New Orleans. I know that the president, Joe Biden, has made this a priority. He convened an emergency national security meeting yesterday, of course, because of the terror elements. It's also interesting that it was linked to how linked it was is a question, I guess, but the timing is very interesting that there was this Las Vegas attack. A Cybertruck was filled with explosives at a Las Vegas Trump hotel. And so the coordination of these was assumed, I think, by many at first, but now the FBI is saying he acted alone. Why are they saying ISIS? Is because there was an ISIS flag on the back of the vehicle. So this isn't picking through Facebook posts as, we've done in the past with these kind of people, or looking through text messages. He wanted to make his intentions clear. He put the ISIS flag on the back of the truck. It's interesting too, Dan, that he is an Army veteran.
Let's be clear, he's a U.S. citizen. There was initial reporting that he might have been an illegal border crosser, but this was an American citizen from Texas. He also did the ISIS connection, the Islamic State, of course, a terrorist organization that operates out of the Middle East, but has cells all over the world. He did post some videos where he expressed his sympathy for the Islamic State, and that and the flag in his truck. At least the FBI is saying this, make it clear that this was an Islamic terrorist attack, but it was an American citizen.
Right, and so inspired by ISIS, what that means is at least as far as authorities know, this man was not directly communicating with some kind of ISIS headquarters overseas and getting supplies and munitions, as has happened with other people in the past. This guy apparently, as you said, as he posted in these videos, whether it was just kind of radicalized probably through the internet. And we've seen this happen before. The DOJ and others really track this kind of thing, especially with young men getting radicalized through the internet, through other videos like the one this guy posted, through discussion forums. There is this kind of dark place in the internet that radicalizes particularly young men. We've seen this pattern play out. This guy's not the first, and I fear he won't be the last. And so I think that's the kind of the question, and we have to be asking is, what narrative combats the narrative that these radicalists are indoctrinating people with? How do we get to them first, and how do we create, maybe a vision of America that addresses some of the criticisms, and makes it less appealing to come after us, but not to blame America at all. Of course, in a country over 300 million people, so diverse, so many different viewpoints, and the internet these days, it's hard to see how you don't have lone wolves rise up and do these kinds of violence. And I think we're just trying to control it and prevent it is all we can focus on.
Yeah, and that seems like I hate to use the word impossible, but it seems like a very difficult task, just because of the way we communicate, the many different ways we can communicate now with social media, with the internet, etc. Well, as bad as the attack was, Casey, it could have been much worse. We also know, and this is one of the reasons why they initially said that they thought he might have had help. They found IEDs, improvised explosive devices, planted around the French Quarter near Bourbon Street in New Orleans. Thankfully, they did not detonate, but it could have been far worse.
Yeah, very grateful for that. I mean, Bourbon Street, of course, is a famously crowded, busy street at this time of year. Mardi Gras, New Year's, the crowd. There's no lack of crowd density there, right? And so it was a prime spot. I mean, and so in that sense, I think it is, grateful that there weren't more people hurt, because the streets can be, actually packed full where you can you're jostling past each other. And so, yeah, even without the ID, thankfully that didn't go off. This could have been a lot worse thankfully, he was killed by police in a shootout after the attack. So no, interrogating, no getting to the bottom of his motives or who may have talked to him. All we can piece through is these other pieces of evidence now that he is dead. I just think it's really interesting, the timing of the Vegas attack, Dan. I don't know if you've put any thought into that, but
just a few hours later, right? Yeah.
Right.
In the Vegas attack, similar scenario. The man, also an Army veteran, rented a truck, a Tesla electric vehicle, packed it with explosives, and just thankfully, in this case too, only the driver was killed when the car exploded. Several people nearby were injured, but no life-threatening injuries there. But yeah, it was a scary day, New Year's Day, just with these two separate attacks on American citizens.
Yeah, and so, you mentioned Trump. We can make it political if we want. Of course, the New Orleans attacker was a U.S. citizen, and it is important to point that out because of some bad reporting early on and, the like. And it actually seems that Trump has kind of latched on to some of that. But regardless of even if it was a border, I think that Trump has made national security a priority. And so, of course, the border is a big part of that. Preventing war is part of that. Cracking down on crime is part of that. And so I wonder if there's anything he can do as part of this national security focus to address these kinds of issues.
Certainly hope so, Casey. But as I said, it does seem like a difficult task. But thank you for joining us. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com. A big thanks to Dan and Casey. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on the collapse of the Santa Cruz wharf and the activists who have resisted its repair projects, it's Eliana Cardodal.
A winter storm carried off the end of the Santa Cruz wharf 2 days before Christmas, indefinitely shutting down the tourist attraction that houses 17 stores and restaurants. Joining me with more on this story is the Center Square's California reporter, Kenneth Schrupp. Kenneth, tell us about this wharf and the damages it sustained.
Eliana, the Santa Cruz wharf is really the centerpiece of Santa Cruz's commercial and tourism industry. It is an icon for the city that stretches out about half a mile from the shore. It's over 100 years old. It was built in 1914 and sits on over 4,000 aging wood pilings that need to be frequently replaced or repaired. The whole sad part about this tragedy, which nearly cost the lives of 3 city workers who were on the pier when it collapsed and was partially brought out to sea, is that this is all entirely preventable. The city has allowed about $14 million of repairs to pile up in a backlog, and they've had plans and funding to move ahead with these repairs, but they've been blocked by environmental groups who say that it would do too much to change the local area and surrounding beauty.
Yeah, the wharf has been the center of controversy for nearly a decade now. Can you get deeper into that?
Yeah, of course. The city approved its 2016 master plan for the wharf 4 years after they introduced it. They approved the plan in 2020 that would have created a walkway around some of the at-risk pilings to help protect the wharf as a bit of a fender, like if on a car, to absorb some of the damage from waves. But local residents organized under a group called Don't Morph the Wharf to block the plan's adoption. And we're finally starting to see the results of delaying these repairs for so long. It also brings up some interesting points about what happens under the California Environmental Quality Act. Don't Morph the Wharf sued the city under CEQA, which allows groups to challenge projects pretty much indefinitely on the grounds that sufficient environmental review has not been completed. This is used to hold up the construction of pretty much anything in the state that someone with enough time and enough money to keep filing court challenges can use to keep stuff from being built pretty much forever. So Don't Morph the Wharf won in court, which led the city to have to unveil an updated plan, which the group has continued to challenge. Jillian Greensight, who's a member of Don't Morph the Wharf, wrote in the Santa Cruz Sentinel about this updated plan, is the city is pushing the impression that the walkway is necessary to preserve the structural integrity of the wharf. Putting obstacles in the way does nothing for safety or structural integrity. She also continued, the Historic Preservation Commission, arguably the most important given the historic nature of the wharf, recommended removal of the west side walkway, which degrades the visual character of the wharf and is incompatible with its historic design. This updated plan, which is pretty much exactly like the 2016 plan, was approved at the start of 2024, but unfortunately, the repairs have not been able to be completed in time. On Monday, December 23rd, just before Christmas, a winter storm collapsed a 150-foot section, resulting in 3 workers being swept away into the sea. Thankfully, they were okay. No one died. No one was seriously injured. But nearby beaches were shut down to the risk of debris. People didn't want to be hit by large chunks of pier that could really hurt someone.
What should we expect going forward?
Well, there's 17 businesses that operate on the pier. It's a hub of economic development for the city and region. That's what Santa Cruz Mayor Fred Keeley said, while he offered financial support for the businesses on the pier that are now affected by this. They're shut down. There's no reopening timeline in sight as this pier remains unfinished. The city did approve a tax hike to shore up its finances, but it's currently in a deficit, and the city expects deficits for the next 8 out of 10 years. So these costly emergency repairs might not be possible without state support. But this being a disaster, albeit an easily averted one, it's now received the governor's attention, and Governor Gavin Newsom announced that he's coordinating with the state disaster agency, which does mean that state disaster funds could soon provide support to actually fix this problem. It's a real shame that this had to become a disaster, but the silver lining is that now the city is going to have the money it needs probably from the state government to make necessary repairs.
Does this change the plan for repairs, or is it still kind of the same process?
I'm not really sure if it changes the plan for repairs. I do think repairs are going to move forward probably as originally planned. What the invocation of a disaster could do is allow these repairs to be made quickly without lawsuits and challenges. That with the proper kind of declaration from the governor, if he deems it an important project, it is possible now to waive CEQA for projects that the governor has determined by executive order to be worthy of it. The governor first deployed this tool to accelerate production of the site's reservoir. It would be the first reservoir in California with more than I believe 1 million gallons of storage since the 1970s. It's been discussed and under construction for or consideration and planning for decades now. And it's only through the governor's new executive order that it's been able to clear the last environmental hurdles for repairs. So we could really see the governor's executive powers put to work here to quickly bring the situation under control.
Well, Kenneth, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Eliana and Kenneth. If you're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour, I'm your host, Chris Krug. Back with more on the death of former President Jimmy Carter, it's Dan McCaleb. Jimmy Carter, the 39th President of the United States, who took office shortly after the tumultuous Nixon years, died Sunday, December 29th, 2024, at his home in Plains, Georgia. He was 100. Joining me to discuss this today is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, you weren't even born yet during Carter's presidency, but I know you've read about him, you studied up on him. First, tell us a little bit about his legacy, and then there's a state funeral plan for him.
That's right, state funeral plan January 9th. I was speaking to the Secret Service about that, about, preparation for the inauguration, and of course, there's January 6th anniversary. There is the Jimmy Carter funeral and the inauguration. So a lot going on here in D.C., a lot of in the security efforts and all that. And, of course, be praying that all goes well. But, Jimmy Carter, a living legend, a one-term president, I think known by many today as maybe one line as a very liberal president who didn't get reelected, and Ronald Reagan kind of came to undo his legacy. I think in many ways that's what people think about Jimmy Carter. Of course, he was more complicated than that, more nuanced than that. And actually, I think a very interesting man. While in the White House, he prioritized energy and energy efficiency. He famously, I don't know if you know this, Dan, but he famously kept the White House very hot because he didn't want to turn on the air conditioning to waste energy. And so kind of trying to set this example as he pushed for a new era of energy. And while I think, some of the things he did were misguided in that regard, in a lot of ways, he was ahead of his time because, an energy revolution was coming. Of course, we're still very reliant on fossil fuels, and I don't think that's going to change in this administration. But, we have seen a transition. We've seen the rise of electric vehicles since his presidency. We have seen, the rise of other alternative energies. And so I think in many ways, Jimmy Carter was mocked for this. And some of his ways of going about it were misguided, as I said. But he was sort of prophetic in seeing that this was a problem that needed to be addressed. Just some, personal details. Of course, he was born in 1924, playing in Georgia. He joined the Navy and graduated top 10% of his class in 1946, of course, just after World War II. But he left the military to save his peanut farm. He was famously a peanut farmer. That's when he got involved in local politics and started working his way up. I think he was often sort of an underestimated, unlikely candidate. But he made his way all the way top, ran for state senate, election after election, was able to piece together this political career. And won the White House and eventually a Nobel Prize in 2002.
Yeah, also served as Georgia's 76th governor. Casey, while you weren't alive yet, I was in elementary school during Jimmy Carter's years, and just based on memory, the two things I remember the most: one, after Richard Nixon resigned during the Watergate scandal and the impeachment proceedings against him, Gerald Ford, as vice president, took office. Ford ran against Jimmy Carter, and just because of the scandal that surrounded Nixon. Didn't surround Ford, but Ford was sort of a victim of that. Carter beat Ford. But then a lot of not so great things happened. There was an energy crisis, gasoline prices soared. And then the biggest memory I have, of course, of Jimmy Carter, so years as president, was the Iran hostage crisis. As I said, I was in elementary school, and we made and put up American flags throughout the classroom in support of the hostages. 53 American diplomats and citizens were held hostage for 444 days. Beyond that, though, I think Carter really was known more for his post-presidential years and the humanitarian volunteer work that he did through Habitat for Humanity, building homes for the poor, fighting for free elections across the world, not necessarily in the United States, and human rights across the world. I think his legacy is more than his presidency. It's really, you got to include that post-presidential work that he did.
Absolutely. I mean, he was known as a philanthropist, and not just the wealthy guy who writes checks from his home, but the guy who actually gets involved and does things on the ground and makes it personal. I mean, you referenced the Habitat for Humanity, but just the idea of a president doing something like that, this kind of the physical labor, that really does speak to who he was. Another example that I referenced was the AC in the White House, and I think that was something very unique about Jimmy Carter, is he made these big principles very personal, and it was not just a big separation always from the private life and the public life. He applied it, personally. And I think that really is tied to his Christian faith, which he was also kind of famous for. There was this sense of personal piety and devotion that he seemed very interested in, and wanted a kind of consistency all the way from the core of who he was and his faith playing out through his politics. And so I think that's why we see many of these kind of philanthropy, the social interest that he took in these different projects. And so in many ways, even if you don't agree with him politically, of course, he is someone that you can respect. And, President Trump released a statement basically to that effect. Maybe you might say uncharacteristically presidential for President Trump. But he honored Jimmy Carter, and just pointed to many of the things that we've spoken of now, and said goodbye now that 100 years old he has passed.
President-elect Trump also says he will attend the state funeral again January 9th next week at the Washington National Cathedral. President Biden, of course, is expected to be there, and Americans across the country can pay their last respects. Casey, thank you for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com. Thanks to Dan and Casey for that update. That'll do it for the first half of the Center Square Radio Hour. After the break, we'll look at more top stories from across the nation. How did homelessness numbers in 2024 compare to past years? How did content moderation debates in schools play out in 2024? And what happened to the labor market over the course of the past year? We'll have all that and more when we'll return on the Center Square Radio Hour. Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. Here are this week's quick hits, some of the original reporting you may have missed at thecentersquare.com. Of the more than 14 million illegal border crossers reported under the Biden administration, an unknown number of violent Venezuelan Tren de Aragua prison gang members illegally entered the country. Now, police records and official law enforcement statements confirm TDA-linked crime and arrests have occurred in at least 22 U.S. states. TDA is known for violence, murder, kidnapping, extortion, bribery, and human and drug trafficking, and are linked to more than 100 law enforcement investigations nationwide. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security is currently looking for 600 suspected Tren de Aragua members and subjects of interest illegally in the United States. Gender transition procedures on minors face intensifying scrutiny as the transgender-friendly Biden administration prepares to step down. Republican lawmakers are demanding a federal health agency review the scientific evidence justifying such treatments. In a letter sent to the Inspector General of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, members of the GOP-led House Committee on Energy and Commerce dubbed the HHS a global outlier for its promotion of puberty blockers and reconstructive surgeries for children. The lawmakers cited European studies and restrictions that contradict the HHS's assertions that such procedures are beneficial. A group of Jewish professors from the City University of New York has challenged the state's Taylor law that forces them to be under the representation of a union that has espoused the anti-Semitic remarks. The professors are represented by the Fairness Center and the National Right to Work Foundation. Professor Avraham Goldstein told the Center Square that he and his colleagues are, quote, challenging the Taylor law because it imposes on us the representation of a union that is actively and vocally anti-Israel, that supports harassing Zionist Jews, and that passed a resolution denying Jewish people their historical rights to their ancestral homeland, end quote. Louisiana Attorney General Liz Murrow says her office will issue guidance on a law that would require that the 10 Commandments be displayed in classrooms statewide. The state has been blocked from putting the law into effect in 5 school districts: Livingston, St. Tammany, Vernon, East Baton Rouge, and Orleans. U.S. District Judge John DeGravelis deemed it, quote-unquote, unconstitutional on its face. That injunction was upheld on November 20th by the 5th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals in New Orleans, and oral arguments on the case in the U.S. Supreme Court are set for January 23rd. Josh Stein was sworn in as North Carolina's governor on New Year's Day, with the ceremonial inauguration scheduled for January 11th at the Capitol. He succeeded Roy Cooper and became the first Jewish governor of the state. In a video message, Stein emphasized priorities such as strengthening the economy, improving public schools, ensuring personal freedoms, and aiding Western North Carolina's recovery. He pledged to work hard to earn the trust of all North Carolinians and faithfully uphold the Constitution over the next 4 years. You can find more on these stories and others like them from across the country at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back with more on the Center Square Radio Hour.
He ran for state office and was beaten. Started a business and failed. Ran for Congress and lost. But thankfully, Abraham Lincoln didn't give up. Persistence. Pass it on. From the Foundation for a Better Life at values.com.
Welcome back to the Santa Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on 2024 homelessness numbers, it's Eliana Kernodle.
The number of homeless people in the U.S. reached the highest level recorded in 2024, as more than 770,000 people lived without housing in a single night in January, according to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's annual report. Joining me with more on this story is the Center Square's Therese Boudreau. Therese, can you lay out the data from this report?
Sure. So the report is a data snapshot. It was collected a year ago, and it showed that there was an 18% increase in homelessness since 2023, which is a record high. And the report also said that a lot of that was from migrants illegally crossing the border and then taking refuge in sanctuary cities where there was not enough housing for them. So essentially what happened is that a lot of these shelters in these cities and other cities as well were flooded by people crossing the border. And so it kind of turned into a twofold problem where the shelters did not have enough resources. And so both non-U.S. residents and the American homeless population, just there weren't enough resources to go around. But the HUD does say that the data, because it was collected more than a year ago, no longer reflects current conditions. So Chicago and Denver, for instance, both sanctuary cities, both saw a marked increase in homelessness. They've announced an end to their migrant shelter systems at this point. So it does seem like 2025 and perhaps the latter half of 2024 looks better than what it did when this data was collected, but it's still a record high.
There were some specific areas that did see a decrease. Can you get into those?
Sure. Yeah. So the report did show that there were some bright spots. Dallas, for instance, they saw a marked decrease, 16% between 2022 and 2024. They created the Street to Home initiative. It was a public-private initiative, and it cut unsheltered homelessness in half, or it will cut unsheltered homelessness in half by 2026, they say. Los Angeles also, they have a high-cost rental market, but they did increase housing availability. And so this led to a decline in homelessness, actually for the first time in 7 years. It declined by 5% since 2023. And then Chester County in Pennsylvania, they actually had the largest, most marked decrease. They had a decrease of nearly 60% since 2019. And they also had different initiatives they did where they had affordable housing groups and fair housing education, prevention methods or efforts, especially for migrant workers. So there are some bright spots. Actually, the report did show as well that veteran homelessness in particular did see a decrease. So an 8% decrease from 2023 to 2024. The numbers specifically, it went from around 35,000 to 32,000. So that is really encouraging.
And as you mentioned, this is just a snapshot. It's just taking the numbers from one specific day in January of last year. It's not necessarily taking the average over the course of the year or anything like that.
Correct.
So how have different organizations responded to this report?
There were a lot of responses. The National Alliance to End Homelessness, they came out with a response almost as soon as the report was released, and they've blamed a lot of the problem on the lack of affordable housing in the U.S. They pointed to there's an estimated shortage of 7.3 million units of affordable and available rental homes in the country. And so they propose as a solution to increase programs that help get people into affordable housing, to increase affordable housing, those kinds of things. But then there are other organizations that say that the problem is a bit more, will require a more multifaceted solution. So I talked with Public Safety Policy Director Devin Kurtz from the Cicero Institute. He's done a lot of research on the driving of homelessness and looking into housing policy. And he says that the data shows that the problem isn't merely economic, although that definitely is part of it, but it's related to public safety and mental illnesses as well. He says there's a bigger behavioral health component, particularly in regards to the unsheltered homeless population. So those who live on the streets, basically. He said it's kind of an all-and situation. There are people who are leaving prisons and becoming homeless, or people who are homeless and cycle through a jail and prison system. He was citing stats, roughly 75% of the unsheltered homeless population sadly had a drug or alcohol addiction. So the homelessness problem in the U.S. is a very complicated problem. And of course, the data is quite stark, but again, it is a year old. And so hopefully in 2025, we'll see much more encouraging data.
Well, Therese, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Eliana and Therese. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Back with more on the ongoing debate over book removals from school libraries. It's Eliana Curdo.
As the battle over allowing certain classroom curricula continues into 2025, two opposing groups shared milestones and failures from the past year regarding explicit books in the classroom. Joining me to dig into this is Chalkboard News editor Brendan Clary. Brendan, book bans or book removals, depending on your perspective on the issue, were an ongoing story this past year. How did PEN America recap this past year?
Yeah, absolutely. So PEN America, for people who might not be familiar with it, is a leading voice in advocacy, an organization that stands against efforts to remove books from libraries. And they call it book bans. So these instances where books are taken off of shelves or put out of reach from children, that's their preferred terminology. we usually use book removals because it's very neutral. And, sometimes books aren't being banned. They're being removed temporarily and then put back. So I think it's a little bit more clear there. But they said that there were 10,000 instances of book bans or book removals in 2024, according to the senior advisor for communications for the organization, Suzanne Trimmel. And she said that they tracked 10,046 instances of book banning during the 2023-2024 school year, and that's a 200% increase over the previous school year. So I think that, in the last few years, this has been a bigger issue since the COVID-19 pandemic. We saw a lot of parental involvement. We've seen a lot of parents getting up at school board meetings and reading passages from these titles to the school board. We've seen some microphones being pulled and cut. And some even times, a police escort. And, there's different reasons for that. Sometimes it's not just that this explicit material, but, maybe they've used up all their time and they want to keep going. Different kinds of things like that can be an issue. But in the last few years, PEN America says since 2021 that they've recorded 16,000 instances of book bans. So, there's that increase kind of exponentially there, I think, if you're talking about 10,000 during the 2023-2024 school year. And one thing to note, too, is PEN America, if a book is removed at any time, that's described as a removal. So there are different states now that require that kind of removal process as part of a challenge. So while books are being challenged, they're removed from shelves, and that's kind of baked into the law in a couple of states. So I think that those are some of the bigger drivers of that, and that's a relatively new thing. And again, PEN America is an advocacy organization that says essentially that students should be able to read what they need because it provides a foundation for their lives. And as Trimmel said, whether critical thinking, empathy across differences, personal well-being, or long-term success, that's what books can offer them. And, quote, undermining the freedom to read for students is a direct assault on their basic rights under the Constitution. So any kind of limitation, PEN America says, is undermining a child's right to read what they want and should be able to read. They mentioned the organization mentioned several lawsuits that it's part of, including one in Florida. They filed a federal lawsuit against censorship in Escambia County in Florida. The organization says they want to show that the county violated students' right to free speech and equal protection under the law by removing or restricting those books. So that's like a big challenge that they have undertaken in the courts to try to show that violated students' rights. I mean, Florida is a big state for that. Like they've had the government there has passed, the legislature has passed laws, and Governor DeSantis has also been a big critic of some of these books in the classroom. So that's a big state for kind of the fight there.
And kind of on the other side of this issue, what did Moms for Liberty have to say looking back over 2024?
So Tiffany Justice, co-founder of Moms for Liberty, spoke with Chalkboard News and essentially said what they've seen is a lot of progress in 2024. And as I mentioned before, Justice pointed out that, quote, you have parents all over the country getting up and reading material that was found in libraries. You had school board members who were shocked, dismayed, uncomfortable, shut off mics, like that they're making their point. So essentially, Justice said, we've seen a lot of sentiment out there saying that these are not okay for our students to read, and that they've shown just how much, quote, explicit graphic sexual content that has made its way into our schools, and so that we need to address it. And so that's what they see is a win. Justice also said that they don't really track how many explicit books have been removed. They don't really have a mechanism, and said, quote, we don't celebrate the need to remove books. It doesn't make them happy, and that it's a waste of taxpayer money. But essentially that, quote, it should never have happened in the first place. So I think that's her position, her organization's position is that it shouldn't have been in there in the first place. But, making people aware of it and trying to get sort of that, we shouldn't have this in the classroom or in the school library, sort of the focus. So again, going back to Florida, they're claiming a legislative success there, the House Bill 1467, which has that process and procedure for librarians for how they buy books. And it also created that process for parents to be able to challenge titles. So if you get up at a school board meeting and you read from a book that is one of the libraries and the school board stops you, Justice said, because they feel it is inappropriate content that you shared at their meeting, that book immediately gets removed from the school. So kind of codifying that. So again, I think Moms for Liberty has stressed a lot of the common sense sort of approach there and saying like, we're not banning books. Like you can go out and buy this book. It's not like the government's telling you can't read it. It's just saying like from a taxpayer perspective, do you want kids to have access to this if we can't read it at the school board meeting, or if it's not okay to read here? And I think you do have, critics of that view coming back and saying, well, if you look at the book as a whole, does it fail to be art? Like, is it of just a prurient interest? And so I think then you kind of have that back and forth of like, really what we seem to be arguing is like, are these kinds of explicit scenes okay in context? Or are they never okay? What is art? Some of these bigger questions that are more unsolvable in a school board meeting, but are currently being litigated in, states like Florida, right? Where they're saying like you're removing a student's right to read. And the state has taken a position and said, no, we are not going to have these kinds of materials in our school library. So how do you sort of legislate that? And, the Supreme Court has some guidelines, but like their guideline is, when you see it in terms of what shouldn't be allowed. And so that kind of makes it difficult of, well, who determines that and at what level should you do it? And should the state or should the county? And so it just gets really messy really quick. And that's kind of, a recap of a lot of the news that we've done over 2024 are these very intense fights over what should be allowed in school libraries and in classroom libraries. And I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon.
Well, Brendan, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at chalkboardnews.com.
Thanks to Eliana and Brendan for that update. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Joining me to reflect on labor trends in 2024, it's PhD economist Dr. Orphe Divounguy. Hey, let's talk about 2024. It's that time of the year, right? I mean, it's an opportunity to look back. There were a lot of things that shaped this year. We had elections. We had policy changes along the way. We've got multiple wars going on in the world, or, military activity. And the labor market here at home, very interesting, right? I mean, we had record low unemployment at one point. We've had jobs reports that have suggested at different times that we were adding jobs to the economy. Of course, we've had significant revisions to the job reports, over the course of the year. Why don't we start with the labor market, since that's a home issue and it affects, I think, the most Americans. What are your biggest takeaways from the labor market from this year?
Look, it's cooled. It's cooled substantially. The number of job openings in 2024 fell from 8.9 million, roughly 9 million jobs, to about 7.7 million jobs. So 1.2 million fewer job openings out there. So it's a labor market that's cooling, right? So relative to the number of people that were unemployed, we went from about 1.3. So we're looking at 36% more job openings than they were unemployed workers, to just about 10% more, right? So there's still more open jobs out there. Of course, it takes a long time for these jobs to get filled because, right, like even though you have jobs, you may not have the right workers to fill those jobs, those vacancies. And so that's cooled down a lot, right? So the people who are unemployed today are taking a long time, are basically struggling to find employment, when compared to just, at the start of the year, there were more abundance of vacancies out there. And so depending on what industry you're in, right, it really depends on what industry you're in. In some industries like healthcare or even in the government sector, it's still a lot easier to find work. And then when you go to other industries, by the way, construction sector is also a quick one, right? That's been where, there's been labor shortages, and that, if you're in that field, it's a lot easier to find work, and it's also easier to see your pay increase faster. But then you have sectors where things are a little bit tougher, like the professionals, right? Professionals and, office type jobs are very difficult. Manufacturing even harder, right? If you're out there looking for work, it's a little tough, out there, when compared to January of 2024 or a year ago.
Right. Do you think now, let me ask you this. I mean, I think this was a matter of much debate in the past year, and maybe this is a carryover issue from 2023. There were a tremendous amount of job listings out there in terms of the number of people who converted on those jobs opportunities, public sentiment seems to be that they were maybe in some cases phantom jobs. Did people get placed? I mean, in particular in the higher paying tech sector, was that an exercise in seeing who's out there and interested in moving, or were there actually positions that were filled?
Look, all you have to do is look at wage growth to tell you how badly employers want to hire workers.
Yeah.
If you're really desperate for workers, what do? Well, you up the ante, you raise wages, right? You posted wages, and wage growth is still pretty strong, cooled from 4.4% on average year-over-year increasing on a year-over-year basis in January to 4% in November. So not a big cool down when it comes to wage increases, right? The bulk of these wage increases come from job to job movements. So employers will probably more likely to poach rather than go to the pool of unemployed workers. And these job to job movements are helping to support wage growth, right? Now, remember, the number of quits has fallen tremendously in the past year as well. And so, and that's also partly why wage growth remains, people are basically saying, hey, look, if I can't find work necessarily, I'd rather just stay on the job. I might just stay on the job. Remember, for you to quit your job, you got to get an offer that's above, and beyond what you're currently getting paid, right? And so,
right.
So the number of quits has fallen tremendously from about 3.2 million quits in January to just 3.1 million quits at the end of the year. Remember back in April 2022, we were at 4.3 million people quitting their jobs on a monthly basis, right? So that's right. That was crazy, right? That great resignation. Well, the great resignation gave way to the great stay. People are no longer quitting because the number of job openings has dwindled. The number of opportunities, the opportunity set has shrunk. That's the labor market. Of course, the inflation picture this year. Also, we've seen a decline, right? Easing inflation, but it seems to have stalled, right? The easing on the inflation front really has stalled. I'm not seeing a ton of progress on the inflation front, towards the end of this year. We saw a bigger labor market cool down this year than we saw inflation, declining further. And I think the Fed is starting to accept that, right? By saying in their summary of economic projections that they're willing to tolerate 2.5% inflation and 2.8% core inflation, in 2025. They're basically hinting that they're okay with that so long as the labor market doesn't deteriorate and cool down further.
Appreciate your thoughts as always, Dr. O. That'll do it for another week of the Center Square Radio Hour. The Center Square Radio Hour is a production of America's Talking Network, produced by Eliana Cardodal. If you missed some of today's show, you can find it at americastalking.com. I'm Chris Krug on behalf of everyone at Franklin News Foundation. Thank you for listening to the Center Square Radio Hour.